A cop stops two teenage girls on their way home. "You match the description," he says. Before they can explain, one is grabbed, a gun is drawn, and in seconds, they're on the ground. But just as their world turns to fear, a black car pulls up. A man steps out, calm, powerful, and deadly serious. "Do you know who I am?" he asks. They don't, because they just attacked the daughters of the most powerful lawman in the country. What happens when justice comes knocking? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the polished floors of the community center's dance studio. Ava and Ariel Brown moved in perfect sync, their reflections dancing alongside them in the wall-length mirrors. As the music faded, both girls broke into wide smiles, their workout clothes damp with sweat from hours of practice. "That turn sequence is getting better," Ava said, grabbing her water bottle. "You're really nailing the emotion in it." Ariel tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear, her eyes bright with pride. "Thanks. I've been working on making it feel more honest, you know?" She reached for her gym bag, movements graceful even in rest. "Do you think we're ready for the showcase?" "Are you kidding?" Ava laughed, throwing an arm around her sister's shoulders. "We were born ready. This neighborhood is going to see what real dancing looks like." They gathered their things, the familiar routine of packing up their dance gear comfortable and calming. The community center had become their second home since moving to this upscale suburb 6 months ago. "Remember when we used to practice in Mom's garage?" Ariel asked as they pushed through the glass doors into the cool evening air. "With the broken mirror and that wonky floorboard?" Ava shook her head, smiling. "This is definitely an upgrade." They walked down the tree-lined street, their dance bags swinging between them. The setting sun painted the expensive houses in shades of gold and pink. Everything felt perfect until the police cruiser pulled up beside them. Two officers stepped out, their expressions stern. "Stop right there," Officer Bradley called out, his hand resting on his belt. The twins froze. Ava instinctively moved closer to her sister, feeling Ariel's body tense beside her. "Is something wrong?" Ava asked, keeping her voice steady despite the sudden flutter of fear in her chest. Officer Kent approached them, his eyes narrow with suspicion. "We had a report of a robbery in the area. The suspects match your description." "We're just walking home from dance practice," Ava explained, gesturing to their dance bags. She could feel Ariel trembling beside her. "We haven't done anything wrong." Ariel took a small step backward, her breathing becoming rapid and shallow. Officer Kent's hand shot out, grabbing her wrist roughly. "Don't move." "Let go of her," Ava cried out, reaching for her sister. "You're hurting her." Everything happened so fast. Officer Bradley drew his weapon, the metal gleaming in the fading light. "On the ground." "Now." The twins dropped to their knees, tears streaming down Ariel's face as Officer Kent maintained his grip on her wrist. Ava's heart pounded so hard she could barely hear anything over the rush of blood in her ears. The quiet purr of an approaching vehicle barely registered until a sleek black car pulled up smoothly beside them. The door opened, and a tall man in an impeccable suit stepped out. Malcolm Brown's presence seemed to fill the entire street as he walked toward them, his steps measured and deliberate. The officer's expressions shifted from authoritative to uncertain as Malcolm approached. He didn't raise his voice or make any sudden movements. His calm demeanor somehow made him even more imposing as he stood before them, his dark eyes taking in every detail of the scene. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft but carried in weight that made both officers straighten their postures. "Do you know who I am?" The question hung in the air like smoke, and the officers' faces drained of color as recognition slowly dawned in their eyes. Officer Bradley's hand trembled slightly as he holstered his weapon. Officer Kent released Ariel's wrist as if it had suddenly burned him. The evening air grew thick with tension as Malcolm Brown's presence commanded the scene. "Sir, we didn't—" Officer Bradley started, but his words trailed off into silence. "Let my daughters up," Malcolm said quietly, his controlled tone carrying more authority than any shout could. "Now." The officers stepped back, and Malcolm moved to help his girls to their feet. Ariel's legs shook so badly she could barely stand. Ava wrapped an arm around her sister's waist, supporting her while trying to hide her own trembling. "Are you hurt?" Malcolm asked, his eyes scanning both girls for injuries. He gently took Ariel's wrist, examining where Officer Kent had grabbed her. A red mark was already forming on her skin. "We're okay, Dad," Ava answered, though her voice cracked slightly. "Just scared." Malcolm nodded, his jaw tightening as he turned back to the officers. "We'll discuss this tomorrow morning at the FBI field office. 8 a.m. sharp. Bring your captain." His tone left no room for argument. The drive home was silent, heavy with unspoken fears and lingering shock. When they pulled into their driveway, Dr. Olivia Brown was already waiting at the door, having received Malcolm's brief text about the incident. "My babies!" she cried out, rushing down the front steps. She gathered both girls into her arms, holding them close as they finally broke down. Ariel's quiet sobs mixed with Ava's shuddering breaths. "How dare they?" Olivia's voice shook with rage as she examined Ariel's wrist. "Malcolm, we need to file charges. This cannot stand." "Inside," Malcolm said softly, ushering his family through the door. While Olivia led the girls to the kitchen for tea and comfort, he stepped into his home office to make a call. "This is Director B. Roan." He spoke into his phone, his voice steady. "I need a meeting tomorrow morning with Officers Bradley and Kent, along with Captain Stevens. Yes, it's urgent." Later that night, after the girls had finally fallen asleep upstairs, Malcolm and Olivia sat in their dimly lit living room. Olivia cradled a cold cup of tea between her hands, her doctor's mind still cataloging every mark, every tremor she'd seen in her daughters. "You can't seriously be considering letting those officers off the hook," she said, setting down her cup. "Malcolm, they pulled a gun on our children." Malcolm leaned forward in his armchair, his elbows resting on his knees. "I'm not letting them off the hook, Liv. I'm thinking bigger than punishment." "Bigger than punishment?" Olivia's voice rose slightly before she caught herself, mindful of the girls upstairs. "They need to face consequences for what they did." "They will," Malcolm assured her, "but not through charges or suspensions. I'm planning something different, a program that could actually change them, change their whole approach to policing." Olivia studied her husband's face in the soft lamplight. "You want to teach them after what they did?" "I want to transform them," Malcolm replied. "Destroying their careers would feel good right now, I know, but it wouldn't solve the real problem. These officers need to understand, really understand, what they did wrong and how to do better." "And if they don't learn?" Olivia challenged. Malcolm's expression remained resolute. "Then they'll face those consequences, but first I have to try. For our girls, and for every other child who might encounter these officers in the future." The morning sun cast long shadows across the FBI field office's polished floors as Officer Bradley and Officer Kent walked in, followed closely by Captain Mason Lewis. Their footsteps echoed in the marble lobby, each step heavy with uncertainty. Officer Bradley tugged at his collar, while Officer Kent's usual confident stride had diminished to something more hesitant. The security desk directed them to the 4th floor, where Malcolm Brown's office was located. As they stepped out of the elevator, they found him waiting in the hallway, his presence as commanding as it had been the previous evening, though now dressed in an impeccable suit rather than casual wear. "Good morning, gentlemen," Malcolm greeted them, his voice carrying the same measured tone from the night before. "Thank you for coming." He extended his hand first to Captain Lewis, then to each officer in turn. Officer Bradley's handshake was stiff while Officer Kent's palm was noticeably damp. Malcolm led them down a corridor to a spacious conference room with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. "Please, have a seat," he said, gesturing to the leather chairs surrounding a large oak table. Once they were settled, Malcolm remained standing, his hands resting lightly on the back of his chair. "I imagine you're wondering why I asked you here instead of filing formal complaints." "Sir, about last night," Officer Bradley started, but Malcolm raised a hand gently. "I'm not here to lecture you or to end your careers," Malcolm said. "I'm here to offer you something different, an opportunity." Captain Lewis leaned forward slightly. What kind of opportunity, Director B. Roan? Malcolm moved to a sleek touchscreen mounted on the wall and pulled up a presentation. A week-long immersive program designed to address unconscious bias in law enforcement. Not through PowerPoints or lectures, but through real experiences. With all due respect, Officer Bradley interrupted, his face flushing. Are you saying we're racist? Because that's not... I'm saying we all have biases, Malcolm replied calmly. Every single one of us. The question is whether we're willing to examine them honestly. Officer Kent shifted uncomfortably in his chair. This feels like a setup. It's not a trap, Malcolm assured them. There will be no cameras, no public exposure, no permanent record. This is about transformation, not punishment. Captain Lewis studied Malcolm's face carefully. And if we decline? Then we can proceed with formal charges regarding last night's incident, Malcolm answered simply. But I believe this alternative could create real change, not just for you, but for every citizen you interact with going forward. He pressed a button on his desk phone. Could you join us, Agent Ortiz? Moments later, a woman in her mid-30s entered the room carrying a tablet. Her presence was both professional and approachable. This is Agent Felicia Ortiz, Malcolm introduced. She'll be coordinating your program if you choose to participate. Agent Ortiz nodded to the group. The scenarios we've designed are challenging but enlightening. They're based on real situations, including experiences similar to what Director Brown's daughters faced last night. Officer Bradley's face paled slightly at the mention of the previous evening, while Officer Kent stared down at his hands. Empathy isn't just a buzzword, Malcolm continued. It's a skill that can be developed, one that can help us recognize and overcome our prejudices. This program isn't about shame or blame, it's about growth. The officers exchanged glances with their captain, their expressions a mix of skepticism and unease. The weight of the choice before them hung heavy in the air-conditioned room. The program begins tomorrow, Agent Ortiz said, sliding folders across the table to each of them. These contain the details and consent forms, should you choose to participate. Malcolm looked at each man in turn, his gaze both challenging and compassionate. The question isn't whether you have biases. The question is, are you willing to face them? The officers sat in uncomfortable silence, the folders untouched before them, as they contemplated stepping into territory far outside their comfort zones. In the Brown family's sunlit living room, Ava and Ariel sat close together on their plush beige couch. The events from the previous night kept replaying in their minds like a bad movie they couldn't turn off. Ava fidgeted with the charm bracelet on her wrist while Ariel hugged her knees to her chest. I just don't understand, Ava said, her voice tight with frustration. How can Dad think some training program will fix what they did? Dr. Olivia Brown walked in from the kitchen, carrying 3 steaming mugs of hot chocolate. She handed one to each of her daughters before settling into the armchair across from them. Your father believes in second chances, she said softly, though her own expression showed concern. But I share your doubts, girls. Those officers pointed a gun at my babies. Ariel wrapped her hands around the warm mug but didn't drink. Every time I close my eyes, I see that gun, she whispered. Ava immediately put an arm around her sister's shoulders. Maybe they should lose their badges, Dr. Brown admitted, her doctor's instinct to heal warring with her maternal instinct to protect. But your father, he sees things differently. Meanwhile, at the FBI field office, Agent Felicia Ortiz stood before Officers Bradley and Kent in a small conference room. Her tablet displayed a detailed schedule as she explained what lay ahead. Over the next week, you'll participate in carefully crafted scenarios, she explained, her tone professional but firm. Each exercise will place you in situations where you'll experience bias firsthand, from the other side. Officer Bradley's jaw tightened. What exactly does that mean? It means you'll walk in others' shoes, Agent Ortiz replied. You'll face prejudice, assumptions, and unfair treatment, just like you've unconsciously inflicted on others. Officer Kent shifted uncomfortably in his chair. And if we refuse? That's your choice, Agent Ortiz said carefully. But considering the alternative is facing formal charges from the FBI director himself, she let the implications hang in the air. The officers exchanged glances before Officer Kent spoke. "We'll do it." Later that afternoon, Malcolm Brown found his daughters in the backyard. They sat on the wooden swing set he'd built years ago, when they were still small enough to need his help reaching the seats. Now they were young women, facing adult realities he'd hoped to protect them from longer. "Can we talk?" he asked, pulling over a garden chair. "About how you're letting them off the hook?" Ava's voice carried an edge he rarely heard. Malcolm sat down, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. "I understand your anger, Ava. Both of you were wronged in a terrible way." "They could have shot us, Dad," Ariel said quietly, her eyes fixed on the ground. "Over nothing." "Not nothing," Malcolm corrected gently. "Over bias, over fear, over assumptions that have been embedded in their training and thinking." "So they get away with it?" Ava demanded. "No," Malcolm shook his head. "They get a chance to change, to really understand what they did wrong and why. Punishment might satisfy our anger, but it won't prevent this from happening to another pair of innocent kids." "But how do you know they'll really change?" Ariel looked up at her father, her eyes searching for reassurance. "I don't," Malcolm admitted. "But I know that if we want to create real change in law enforcement, we have to be willing to show a different way. Sometimes transformation is more powerful than punishment." Ava's shoulders relaxed slightly as she considered her father's words. Ariel reached for her sister's hand, squeezing it gently. Though neither girl was fully convinced, they began to see the bigger picture their father envisioned. A world where such confrontations might become less common, one transformed officer at a time. The morning sun cast long shadows as Officers Bradley and Kent approached the convenience store in their civilian clothes. Agent Ortiz's instructions echoed in their minds. Experience the scenario without breaking character, no matter what happened. Bradley wore faded jeans and a plain gray t-shirt, while Kent had on worn khakis and a navy polo. As they entered the store, the clerk's eyes immediately locked onto them. He followed their movements through the security mirrors, his hand hovering near the phone. "Can I help you find something?" the clerk called out sharply, though they'd barely taken 5 steps inside. Bradley reached for a bag of chips. "Just browsing," he answered, trying to keep his voice neutral. The clerk moved from behind the counter, trailing them through the aisles. "You need to leave your backpack at the front," the clerk demanded, pointing to Kent's small shoulder bag. Kent's face flushed red. "There's nothing in here," Kent protested, but caught Bradley's warning glance. Reluctantly, he handed over his bag, feeling the sting of baseless suspicion. Every time they picked up an item, the clerk appeared. "That's $5.99, he'd say, or "Those aren't on sale." It was clear he expected them to steal something. After paying for their items, they heard the clerk mutter into his phone as they left. Bradley's hands were shaking with suppressed anger. Later that afternoon, they found themselves walking through Oakwood Heights, an exclusive neighborhood with manicured lawns and sprawling mansions. Within minutes, a white security SUV crawled alongside them. "Excuse me," called the security officer through his open window. "This is a private community. Can I see your resident passes?" "We're just walking," Bradley explained, his earlier frustration building again. The security officer stepped out of his vehicle. "Without proper identification, I'll have to ask you to leave. We've had reports of suspicious persons in the area." Kent's jaw clenched. "Suspicious how?" "Sir, please don't make this difficult," the security officer said, his hand resting on his belt. "Exit the neighborhood now, or I'll be forced to call the police." The irony wasn't lost on either officer as they turned around, feeling the security vehicle escort them to the gates like criminals. Back at the FBI field office, Agent Ortiz sat across from them in a small conference room. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as she pulled up a presentation on the wall screen. "So," she began, "how did it feel?" "It felt staged," Bradley said immediately. "Nobody actually gets treated that way." Agent Ortiz clicked to the next slide, displaying a graph. These are documented incidents of store surveillance targeting specific demographics. Notice the frequency. She clicked again. And these are complaints filed about private security profiling in upscale neighborhoods. Kent leaned forward, studying the numbers. That many? Every scenario you experienced today was based on real incidents, Agent Ortiz explained. The convenience store clerk's behavior, reported just last month. The private security confrontation, 2 weeks ago. She pulled out a tablet and played a video testimony. A young professional described being followed in stores, questioned in his own neighborhood, stopped repeatedly while driving home from work. The only thing staged about today was that you were the targets, Agent Ortiz said quietly. For many Americans, this is their daily reality. Bradley stared at his hands, remembering how quickly his anger had risen after just 2 incidents. Kent sat back in his chair, unusually quiet. Tomorrow will be different scenarios, Agent Ortiz continued. But I want you to sit with today's experiences. Think about how quickly you felt defensive, frustrated, angry, and then imagine feeling that way every single day. The officers exchanged glances, their earlier certainty about right and wrong beginning to crack around the edges. Neither spoke, but their silence carried the weight of uncomfortable recognition. Perhaps what they'd dismissed as complaints or exaggerations had more truth than they'd been willing to see. The dance studio buzzed with activity as teenage girls stretched and warmed up for rehearsal. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, creating long rectangles of light on the polished wooden floor. Ava and Ariel Brown moved through their positions mechanically, their usual grace dampened by heavy thoughts. Tiana Roberts noticed immediately. Her dark eyes followed the twins as they fumbled steps they'd mastered weeks ago. During a water break, she pulled Ava aside, her face creased with concern. "Hey, what's going on?" "You seem really off today," Tiana whispered, sitting cross-legged beside Ava on the floor. Ava's hands trembled as she unscrewed her water bottle. "Something happened yesterday," she said, her voice barely audible. "These cops stopped us on our way home from practice. They ... She swallowed hard. "They pulled a gun on us, Tiana, just for walking home." Tiana's eyes widened in horror. "Oh my God," she breathed, wrapping an arm around her friend's shoulders. "Are you okay? Is Ariel okay?" Across the room, Ariel stood alone by the bar, pretending to stretch. A tear rolled down her cheek, which she quickly wiped away with the back of her hand. Her shoulders hunched forward as if trying to make herself invisible. "Dad showed up just in time," Ava continued, watching her sister. "But Ariel hasn't said more than 2 words since it happened. I don't know how to help her." Meanwhile, at the FBI field office, Malcolm Brown sat at his desk reviewing reports when his phone rang. Captain Mason Lewis's name flashed on the screen. "B-Roan," he answered, his voice steady and professional. "Director, we need to talk about Bradley and Kent," Captain Lewis said, tension evident in his tone. "They're pushing back hard against this program of yours. Kent's threatening to resign, and Bradley's talking about filing a formal complaint." Malcolm leaned back in his chair, his expression unchanged. "Are they? And what's your take on this, Captain?" "With all due respect, sir, maybe we should consider alternative disciplinary actions. Something more conventional." "Like what?" Malcolm's voice remained calm but carried an edge of steel. "Suspension? Sensitivity training videos? We both know those don't create lasting change." He paused, letting his words sink in. "If they walk away now, Captain, they're only proving they're not ready to face their own biases. Real growth isn't comfortable. It's not meant to be." "Yes, sir, but..." "No buts, Captain. They complete the program or they face the consequences of their actions. Those are the options." That evening, the Brown home filled with the smell of Dr. Olivia's signature lasagna. She found the twins in their shared bedroom, still in their dance clothes, but lying listlessly on their beds. "Girls," she said softly, sitting on the edge of Ariel's bed. "The showcase is in 2 weeks. Don't let what happened steal your joy in dancing." Ava sat up, hugging her knees. "I can't stop thinking about it, Mom. Every time we practice, I remember walking home yesterday and..." "I know, baby," Olivia interrupted gently. "But we can't let fear win. Your dancing has always been your strength. your voice. Now more than ever, you need that. Ariel rolled over, her first movement in hours. "What if it happens again?" she whispered. "Then we'll face it together," Olivia said firmly. "But right now, you both need to keep moving forward, one step at a time." Later, the family gathered around the dining table. Malcolm served portions of lasagna while Olivia poured glasses of water. The usual dinner chatter was absent, replaced by the quiet clink of forks against plates. Each family member seemed lost in their own thoughts. Malcolm considering the officer's resistance, Olivia watching her daughters with worried eyes, Ava pushing food around her plate, and Ariel staring at her untouched dinner. The weight of recent events hung heavy in the air, mixing with the uncertainty of what the coming days might bring. They ate in silence, each hoping that somehow, this painful chapter would lead to something better. The morning sun filtered through the Venetian blinds of the FBI field office's conference room, casting striped shadows across Officer Bradley and Officer Kent as they settled into their seats. Agent Felicia Ortiz stood at the front of the room, her professional demeanor masking any personal opinions she might hold about the two officers. "Today's scenario," she began, smoothing her blazer, "will place you in a corporate environment. You'll be interviewing for executive positions at Mason and Wells Consulting." She passed them each a folder containing their mock resumes and background information. Officer Bradley flipped through the papers, his jaw tightening. "These credentials are impressive. MBA from Stanford, years of relevant experience." "Yes," Agent Ortiz nodded. "On paper, you're more than qualified for these positions. Pay attention to how the interviewers respond to you despite these qualifications." Officer Kent shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "What exactly are we supposed to be looking for?" "Just be yourselves and notice how you're treated," Agent Ortiz replied. "The interview panel has been briefed on their roles. Remember, you're to stay in character no matter what happens." An hour later, both officers found themselves in a sleek downtown office building, dressed in crisp suits that felt foreign compared to their usual uniforms. The mock interview setup was impressive. A panel of 3 professionals seated behind a polished mahogany table, their expressions carefully neutral. Officer Bradley went first. Despite his practiced responses and the stellar qualifications on his resume, the interviewer's subtle dismissiveness became increasingly apparent. "We handle very complex financial models here," one interviewer said, her tone suggesting doubt. "Are you sure you could keep up with the fast pace?" Bradley's face flushed. "My resume shows extensive experience with—" Yes, another interviewer cut him off, barely glancing at the document. "But this is a different level entirely. Perhaps something more entry-level would be better suited?" Officer Kent watched through a one-way mirror, his stomach tightening as he recognized the patronizing tone he'd used himself countless times during traffic stops. When it was his turn, the experience hit even harder. "Your background is interesting," the lead interviewer said, emphasizing the word in a way that made it sound like a flaw. "But we're looking for someone who can truly fit into our corporate culture, someone who understands our clients' expectations." Kent found himself stumbling over words he'd rehearsed perfectly earlier. "I have extensive leadership experience." "Managing what exactly?" The interviewer's smile didn't reach his eyes. "We need someone who can handle real responsibility." By the time they returned to the FBI field office that evening, both officers were visibly shaken. Agent Ortiz waited for them in the conference room, a stack of research papers on the table before her. "How did it feel?" she asked simply. Officer Kent spoke first, his voice quiet. "They never directly said anything wrong, but they made you feel like you didn't belong," Agent Ortiz finished. "Like no matter what your qualifications were, you weren't good enough." Officer Bradley ran a hand over his face. "They kept talking down to us, asking if we could handle basic tasks like we were children." Agent Ortiz spread out several documents. "These are studies showing how subtle discrimination affects job candidates from marginalized backgrounds. The same qualifications, different treatment." She paused, letting them absorb the information. "This is what people face every day, not just in job interviews but in stores, on the street, and yes, in interactions with law enforcement. The officers studied the papers in silence, the weight of recognition settling over them. The statistics and testimonies seemed to carry new meaning now, connected to their own fresh memories of feeling diminished and dismissed. "We'll pick this up tomorrow," Agent Ortiz said, gathering her materials. "Take some time to process what you experienced today." As they left the building, neither officer spoke, both lost in thought about how quickly their confidence had crumbled in the face of subtle but persistent bias. The early morning light filtered through the kitchen blinds as Ariel Brown pushed her scrambled eggs around her plate. Her appetite had vanished since the incident. Across the table, Ava Brown checked her phone repeatedly, her own breakfast barely touched. "You girls need to eat something," Dr. Olivia Brown said, setting down her coffee mug. Her eyes held concern as she studied her daughters. "You'll need your strength today." "I'm not hungry," Ariel mumbled, putting down her fork. "What if everyone at school is talking about what happened?" Ava straightened her shoulders. "Let them talk, we didn't do anything wrong." "That's right, Doctor." Olivia nodded, reaching across to squeeze Ariel's hand. "And remember, you have your dance showcase auditions coming up soon. That's something positive to focus on." Ariel's eyes brightened slightly at the mention of dance. Ms. Delgado said the judges from Juilliard might attend this year. "See?" Dr. Olivia smiled. "Channel your energy into what you love. That's how we move forward." She checked her watch. "I need to head to the hospital for my shift, but Dad will pick you up after school. He wants to show you around the field office." "Why?" Ava asked, finally taking a bite of toast. "Because it's part of his life and he wants to share it with you," Dr. Olivia replied, gathering her things. "Besides, I think he wants you to see that not all law enforcement is like what you experienced." The twins exchanged a glance, silently acknowledging their mother's unspoken message. Their father was trying to heal what had been broken. The hallways of Jefferson High buzzed with the usual Monday morning chaos. Ava leaned against her locker while Tiana Roberts, her best friend since elementary school, applied a fresh coat of lip gloss. "I had another nightmare last night," Ava confessed quietly. "I keep seeing that gun pointed at us." Tiana capped her lip gloss, her expression softening. "That's awful, Av. Have you told your parents?" "Mom would just worry more, and Dad—" Ava shook her head. "He's busy with his rehabilitation project for those officers." "You know what might help?" Tiana suggested, her eyes lighting up. "Channel all that emotion into your dance? That piece you've been working on about resilience? This is exactly what it's about." A few lockers down, Ariel pretended to search for a textbook while straining to hear her sister's conversation. The sound of whispers behind her made her freeze. "They're lucky their dad is FBI," a boy's voice said. "Otherwise those cops would have gotten away with it." "Must be nice having connections," another replied. Ariel slammed her locker shut, her cheeks burning. She felt judged, as if people thought they'd somehow use their father's position for special treatment. "Ariel?" A gentle voice interrupted her thoughts. Ms. Delgado, their dance teacher, stood beside her, concern evident in her eyes. "Everything okay?" "Just tired," Ariel managed. Ms. Delgado nodded knowingly. "I heard about what happened. I want you to know how impressed I am with your resilience." She lowered her voice. "And I hope you and Ava are still planning to compete in the showcase auditions. Your talent deserves to be seen." "We're still practicing," Ariel replied, feeling a small spark of determination return. "Good," Ms. Delgado smiled. "Sometimes art is the best response to adversity." The gleaming corridors of the FBI field office felt imposing, as Malcolm Brown led his daughters and Tiana through the building that afternoon. "And this is where we analyze digital evidence," he explained, pointing to a room filled with computers and serious-faced agents. Ava nodded politely, but her mind was elsewhere. Ariel stayed close to Tiana, who was clearly impressed by everything she saw. As they rounded a corner toward Malcolm's office, two familiar figures appeared in the hallway. Officer Bradley and Officer Kent stopped abruptly, their faces registering shock at seeing the twins. Time seemed to freeze. The officers lowered their heads in a mixture of shame and awkwardness. Ava stared directly at them, her body tensing as memories flashed through her mind. The pavement against her cheek, the cold metal of the gun, the fear. Ariel looked away, unable to meet their eyes, uncertain how to process this unexpected confrontation. The silence stretched for only seconds but felt much longer. Finally, Malcolm Brown stepped forward, placing a protective hand on each daughter's shoulder. "Let's continue to my office, shall we?" he said quietly, guiding them past the officers. As they walked away, Ava glanced back once. The officers remained rooted in place, their expressions uneasy and reflective. In that brief moment, something unspoken passed between them, an acknowledgement that whatever transformation Malcolm Brown had planned, it was far from complete. Malcolm Brown leaned forward in his chair, his fingers interlocked on the polished conference table. The morning sunlight streamed through the FBI field office windows, casting long shadows across the serious faces of Agent Felicia Ortiz and Captain Mason Lewis. "The simulations are valuable," Malcolm said, his voice measured and calm. "But they need to see the real impact of systemic bias, not just role-play it." Agent Ortiz nodded, pulling up some notes on her tablet. "I've been in contact with Pastor James Watson from the Hope Community Church. He's well respected in the neighborhood and knows exactly what these officers need to see." Captain Lewis shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Are you sure this is safe? Tensions are already high after what happened with your daughters." Malcolm's expression remained steady, though his eyes flickered with momentary pain at the mention of Ava and Ariel. "Pastor Watson has arranged everything. The community knows this is about education, not enforcement." Later that morning, Officer Bradley gripped the passenger door handle as Pastor Watson's old sedan bounced over another pothole. Officer Kent sat quietly in the back seat, taking in the changing landscape as they drove deeper into the city's forgotten corners. "See that playground?" Pastor Watson pointed to a rusty set of swings. 3 times last month, our kids were questioned by patrol cars, just for playing basketball after school. Bradley watched a group of teenagers scatter as another police cruiser rolled past. His stomach tightened, recognizing the fear in their movements, the same fear he'd seen in Ariel Brown's eyes. They pulled up to a small convenience store where a young woman struggled with grocery bags while keeping an eye on 2 small children. Pastor Watson rolled down his window. "Morning, Miss Thompson. Need a hand?" The woman's smile faded when she noticed the officers in the car. She quickly gathered her children closer. "It's okay, Sarah," Pastor Watson assured her. "These officers are here to listen." Sarah Thompson hesitated before approaching the car. "Listen to what? How I got detained last month because I matched a description? How my boys cry whenever they see a patrol car now?" Officer Kent stepped out of the car, his movements deliberately slow and non-threatening. "Ma'am, if you're willing to share, we'd like to hear your story." Sarah studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "My boys were late for school that day because the officers wouldn't let me leave." The community center hummed with nervous energy as residents filed in, casting wary glances at the 2 officers seated near the front. Pastor Watson stood at the podium, his presence helping to ease the tension. "We're here to share our truth," he announced. "These officers have agreed to listen without judgment or defense." From her position near the back wall, Agent Ortiz watched the officers' faces as speaker after speaker approached the microphone. An elderly man described being pulled over 3 times in 1 week. A teenager talked about being followed through stores. A teacher shared how her students practiced what to say if stopped by police. Bradley's jaw clenched tighter with each story. Kent's notebook remained open but untouched, his pen forgotten as he absorbed the raw emotions in each testimony. During a brief break, Kent found Bradley near the water cooler. His voice was barely above a whisper. "I never knew it was this bad." He stared into his paper cup, shoulders slumped. "How many times have we been part of someone's story here? How many times did we just not see it?" Bradley couldn't answer. He was too busy remembering all the routine stops that maybe weren't so routine after all. Dr. Olivia Brown stood in the spacious living room, watching her daughters attempt their dance routine for the 10th time that morning. The sunlight streamed through large windows, but the usual grace and precision that defined the twins' movements was noticeably absent. "Let's try the turn sequence again," she suggested gently, her doctor's instincts picking up on their mounting frustration. Ava stumbled mid-spin, something she hadn't done since she was 12. "I can't focus," she muttered, running her hands through her hair. "I keep thinking about those officers just getting away with it." Ariel nodded, sinking down onto the couch. Dad could have made an example of them. Maybe then other officers would think twice before pulling guns on innocent kids. Dr. Olivia Brown sat between her daughters, wrapping an arm around each of them. "Your father believes in changing hearts, not just enforcing consequences." "But what about justice?" Ava's voice cracked slightly. The school gymnasium echoed with the sound of dance music later that afternoon. Tiana Roberts watched from the sidelines as the twins practiced their showcase routine. Afternoon light filtered through high windows, creating dramatic shadows on the polished floor. "Use it," Tiana called out as Ava executed a complex series of steps. "Put all those feelings into the movement." Ava's body responded, her movements becoming sharper, more precise. Each gesture carried the weight of her anger, transforming it into something powerful and beautiful. For a moment, she wasn't just dancing, she was telling their story. Ariel followed her sister's lead, matching her intensity until suddenly, she froze. Her hand trembled, remembering the cold grip of Officer Kent on her wrist. The memory of the gun pointing at them flashed through her mind. "I'm sorry," she whispered, stepping back. "I saw his face again." Tiana rushed forward, steadying her friend. "That's okay. Take a breath. Remember what Ms. Delgado said. Dance can heal us if we let it." The evening cast long shadows across Malcolm Brown's office at the FBI field office. Dr. Olivia Brown paced near the window, her reflection ghosting across the glass. "Tell me this isn't just wishful thinking, Malcolm," she said, turning to face her husband. "Tell me these officers are actually changing." Malcolm leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. Today, during the community ride-along, Officer Kent couldn't even speak after hearing a mother's story about being detained in front of her children. Bradley looked physically ill when he realized how many times he'd made similar stops. "Feeling bad isn't enough," Olivia insisted. "Our girls are struggling. This morning, they couldn't even get through their dance routine." "I know," Malcolm's voice softened, but Officer Kent asked to speak with Pastor Watson privately after the session. He wanted to know how he could help rebuild trust in the community. "That's not guilt, Olivia. That's the beginning of real change." Olivia sank into a chair across from his desk. "I want to believe in this transformation you're trying to create. But every time I see Ariel jump at sudden noises or catch Ava staring into space." "The healing takes time." Malcolm reached across to take her hand. "For everyone involved." Olivia squeezed his hand, allowing herself to feel a glimmer of hope. Yet her mother's heart remained cautious, knowing their daughter's path to recovery was just beginning. The morning sun cast long shadows through the FBI conference room windows as Agent Felicia Ortiz stood before the projection screen. Her dark suit contrasted sharply with the white wall behind her as she outlined her proposal to Malcolm Brown. "We need to test their progress in a high-pressure situation," she explained, clicking through slides showing previous police encounters gone wrong. "Something that mirrors the incident with your daughters, but gives them a chance to demonstrate what they've learned." Malcolm Brown nodded slowly, his fingers laced together on the polished conference table. "What exactly did you have in mind?" "A staged emergency call. We'll create a scenario with an allegedly suspicious person in a parking lot. Our undercover agent will play the role, exhibiting nervous behavior that might typically trigger an aggressive response." Malcolm leaned forward, his expression serious. "The scenario needs to feel authentic, real enough to test their instincts, but controlled enough to prevent any actual danger." "We've selected Agent Rodriguez for the role," Ortiz continued. "He's experienced in these training exercises and knows how to maintain the right level of tension." Later that morning, the call crackled over Officer Bradley and Kent's radio. "Suspicious male loitering in the Riverside Plaza parking lot. Possible weapon. Please respond." Bradley's hands tightened on the steering wheel as Kent acknowledged the call. The empty parking lot came into view, scattered with fallen leaves that skittered across the concrete in the autumn breeze. They spotted the figure immediately, a man in a dark hoodie pacing near a lamppost. His hands kept moving in and out of his pockets, his head turning sharply at their approach. Bradley felt the familiar surge of adrenaline, the old instinct to draw his weapon rising up. But he remembered the community center, the mother's tearful story of being wrongly detained. He took a deep breath. Kent stepped out first, keeping his voice steady. "Sir, we'd like to speak with you for a moment." The man, Agent Rodriguez, though they didn't know it, jerked around, his movements erratic. "I ain't doing nothing wrong. Why you hassling me?" Bradley positioned himself carefully, maintaining distance while staying visible. "No one's hassling you, sir. We just received a call and need to check things out. Could you keep your hands where we can see them?" The tension crackled in the air. Rodriguez's hand moved suddenly toward his waistband. In the past, both officers might have drawn their weapons instantly. Instead, Kent spoke calmly. "Sir, we're just here to talk. Would you mind showing us your hands slowly?" Rodriguez complied, revealing empty palms. The interaction continued for several minutes, with the officers maintaining professional composure, despite the suspect's agitated behavior. In the observation room, Malcolm Brown watched the scene unfold through one-way glass. Agent Felicia Ortiz stood beside him, making notes on her tablet. "Notice the difference in their body language," she commented. "No aggressive posturing, no immediate escalation." "They're actually listening to him," Malcolm observed, watching as Bradley and Kent engaged in conversation with Rodriguez, who was gradually becoming less confrontational. When the exercise concluded, the officers entered the debriefing room. Their faces showed the lingering effects of adrenaline, but there was something else too, a quiet satisfaction. "That was excellent work," Ortiz began, pulling up video footage of their interaction. "Let's break down your response. Notice how you maintained distance without creating unnecessary tension." Bradley stared at the footage, his expression thoughtful. "A week ago, I would have approached this completely differently." Kent nodded, running a hand through his hair. The moment his hand went toward his waistband, I felt the old instincts kick in, but... He paused, searching for words. I remembered what Pastor Watson said about fear going both ways. The morning sunlight streamed through the bay window of the Brown residence, casting a warm glow over Ava and Ariel as they sat cross-legged on Ava's bed. The twins had been quiet all morning, each lost in their own thoughts until Ava finally broke the silence. "I've been thinking about Dad's approach with those officers," Ava said softly, picking at a loose thread on her comforter. Maybe he's right about transformation being more powerful than punishment." Ariel hugged her knees to her chest, her voice barely above a whisper. "I saw them yesterday at Dad's office. They looked different somehow. Less intimidating." She paused, searching for the right words. "Their eyes were different, like they actually saw us as people this time." "I know what you mean," Ava nodded, reaching for her sister's hand. "It's weird, but I actually felt a tiny bit sorry for them during that hallway moment. They looked so ashamed." "Do you think Dad's program is really working?" Ariel asked, her eyes meeting her twins. "I think it might be. And honestly, getting them fired wouldn't fix the bigger problem, would it?" The sisters made a quiet pact to trust their father's method, even if it meant pushing past their own fears and doubts. Later that afternoon, the school gymnasium buzzed with excitement as students gathered for an unexpected assembly. Ms. Delgado stood at the podium, her face beaming with joy. "Thanks to an incredible donation from our local business community," she announced, "our dance program will be receiving new equipment, costumes, and funding for competition travel." The twins exchanged surprised looks as applause filled the gym. After the assembly, Ms. Delgado pulled them aside, her eyes sparkling with enthusiasm. "I have a special project in mind," she said. "Would you two be interested in choreographing a piece that showcases different dance styles? Something that celebrates unity and acceptance?" Ava's face lit up. "We'd love to." "We could blend contemporary with hip-hop and classical," Ariel added, already warming to the idea. That evening, the Brown family gathered around their dining room table, the gentle clink of silverware punctuating their conversation. Malcolm's face held a quiet satisfaction as he shared the news about the officer's progress. They handled the test scenario beautifully, he explained, passing the bowl of green beans to Dr. Olivia. No weapons drawn, no aggressive posturing. They used dialogue and patience instead. Dr. Olivia's shoulders relaxed visibly. That's actually wonderful to hear. We got some good news today, too, Ava said, exchanging a glance with her sister. The school dance program received a huge donation, and Ms. Delgado asked us to choreograph a special piece. We want to create something about resilience, Ariel added quietly. About understanding and growth. Malcolm's eyes softened with pride. That sounds perfect. When do you think you'll be ready to perform it? Maybe in a few weeks, Ava replied, her voice growing stronger. We have some ideas already. The family continued their meal, sharing warm smiles and gentle conversation. Though unspoken, they all felt the shift in the air, a tentative hope taking root, even as they recognized there was still work to be done. The morning light filtered through the high windows of the school gymnasium as Ava and Ariel Brown sat with Ms. Delgado, spreading sheets of paper across the polished floor. Their dance ideas flowed freely now, inspired by recent events that had changed their lives. What if we use these white sheets? Ava suggested, holding up a piece of fabric. They could represent the walls we face, the assumptions people make about us. Ms. Delgado nodded thoughtfully. Simple but powerful. How would you incorporate them into the choreography? Ariel, who had been quieter, spoke up. Maybe we start wrapped in them like we're trapped. Then, as the dance progresses, we break free. Her voice grew stronger as she continued. It could show how barriers can be broken down. Tiana Roberts, who had been sketching nearby, held up her notebook. I have an idea for the backdrop, she said excitedly. We could create a wall that appears to crumble during your performance. Start with harsh lines that soften and transform. Ms. Delgado's eyes lit up. That's exactly the kind of visual metaphor we need. It reinforces the message without being too obvious. At the FBI field office, Malcolm Brown and Agent Felicia Ortiz sat in a dimly lit room, reviewing footage from the previous day's mock emergency call. The screen showed Officer Bradley and Officer Kent approaching the situation with newfound restraint. Notice their body language, Agent Ortiz pointed out. No hands near their weapons, maintaining a safe but respectful distance. Malcolm nodded, his expression serious. The difference is remarkable, but we need to push further. He turned to face Agent Ortiz. Design scenarios with higher stakes. We need to ensure this change holds under real pressure. I'll arrange more complex situations, Agent Ortiz agreed. Maybe multiple suspects, unclear threats. Really test their new approach. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the community center as Officer Bradley and Officer Kent sat among local residents. Pastor James Watson had organized a youth speaking session, and the officers found themselves increasingly affected by each story. A teenager named Marcus stepped up to share his experience. I was just walking home from basketball practice, he began, his voice steady but hurt. Next thing I know, I'm against a wall being searched. No reason given, no explanation. Officer Bradley shifted uncomfortably in his chair, the scene painfully familiar. It was exactly how they had treated the Brown twins. Another youth spoke about being followed in stores, and Officer Kent found himself remembering the convenience store scenario from their training. But this wasn't a training exercise. This was real life, real pain. During a break, Officer Bradley turned to his partner. We've been part of this problem, haven't we? He said quietly. Officer Kent nodded slowly. All those times we claimed we were just following protocol. He trailed off, watching a group of teenagers laugh together near the water fountain. We never stopped to think about the impact. Pastor Watson approached them, offering coffee. It takes courage to listen, really listen to these stories, he said gently. How are you both processing this? It's hard, Officer Bradley admitted. These kids, they could be anyone's children. They could have been the Brown twins. That's exactly right, Pastor Watson replied. Every person we encounter is someone's child, someone's loved one. When we forget that, we forget our humanity. The afternoon continued with more testimonies, each story adding another layer to the officers' growing understanding. They sat in silence, absorbing the weight of countless similar incidents, finally seeing the full scope of what their biases had perpetuated. The morning sun streamed through the brown kitchen windows as Dr. Olivia Brown moved efficiently between the stove and counter, preparing a hearty breakfast of pancakes and fresh fruit. The aroma of coffee and maple syrup filled the warm space, creating a cozy atmosphere despite the serious conversations ahead. "Your choreography is really coming together," Dr. Olivia said, sliding plates in front of her daughters. "When are the final auditions?" Ava picked up her fork, her eyes bright with determination. "Next Thursday. Ms. Delgado says we're ready, but I still want to practice the transition in the middle section." "We need to nail the timing perfectly," Ariel added softly, pushing a strawberry around her plate. Though still quiet, her voice carried more confidence than it had in recent weeks. Malcolm Brown sat at the head of the table, his FBI badge glinting on his belt. He cleared his throat gently. "Girls, I wanted to let you know we're entering the final phase of the program with Officers Bradley and Kent." Both twins looked up sharply. Ava set down her fork. "Do you really think they've changed, Dad?" "Are they different now?" Ariel's question came out barely above a whisper. Malcolm took a thoughtful sip of coffee before answering. "They've shown remarkable progress, but this last phase will truly test how deep that change goes." Dr. Olivia joined them at the table, her expression a mixture of hope and lingering concern. "Just be certain, Malcolm. We can't afford any mistakes." At the FBI field office, the fluorescent lights cast a stark glow as Agent Felicia Ortiz spread out a detailed plan across the conference room table. Officers Bradley and Kent sat attentively, their postures notably less defensive than when they'd first arrived weeks ago. "Today's exercise has two components," Agent Ortiz explained, pointing to different sections of the document. "First, you'll patrol a designated area handling only basic civil complaints. We want to observe your approach to routine calls." Officer Bradley nodded slowly. "And the second part? You'll face a more challenging scenario, one that might trigger old instincts." Agent Ortiz's gaze was direct. "We need to ensure your progress holds under pressure." Officer Kent shifted in his chair. "What kind of scenario?" "That information comes later," Agent Ortiz replied firmly. "The point is to test genuine reactions." Both officers exchanged glances, uncertainty clear on their faces. But after a moment, Officer Bradley straightened his shoulders. "We're ready. We want to prove we've learned from our mistakes." "Agreed," Officer Kent added. "Whatever it takes." Later that afternoon, their patrol car rolled slowly down a peaceful residential street. A call came through about a disturbance, a homeowner accusing a teenage neighbor of vandalizing property. When they arrived, they found an angry middle-aged man pointing at overturned trash cans and a nervous-looking teen boy standing nearby. In the past, they might have immediately confronted the teenager. Instead, Officer Bradley approached both parties with measured calm. "Sir, can you tell me exactly what you witnessed?" he asked the homeowner. Officer Kent, meanwhile, noticed scattered paw prints in the spilled garbage. He walked the perimeter carefully, gathering evidence before making any assumptions. After 15 minutes of patient investigation and questioning, they discovered the real culprit, a local stray dog that had been causing similar problems throughout the neighborhood. The officers exchanged knowing looks as they helped clean up the mess. This situation could have gone very differently if they'd acted on their old biases, automatically assuming the teen was guilty simply because he was accused. The high school auditorium buzzed with nervous energy as students gathered for the dance showcase auditions. Sunlight filtered through tall windows, casting long shadows across the polished floor, where Ava Brown and Ariel Brown stood in matching white outfits, their faces composed but hearts racing. Ms. Delgado sat at the judges' table alongside Sarah Chen, the local performing arts coordinator, both holding clipboards and wearing encouraging smiles. In the front row, Tiana Roberts positioned her phone carefully, ready to capture the moment. As the music began, a haunting melody that filled the space, The twins moved in perfect synchronization. Their choreography told the story of fear and hope, of being judged and rising above. White sheets flowed around them like wings as they spun and leaped, their movements both powerful and vulnerable. Ariel's usually hesitant demeanor melted away as she danced, her body expressing what words couldn't. Ava's strength showed in every gesture, but there was a new softness to her movements, reflecting growth beyond anger. Together they created something magical. When the final note faded, silence held for a breathtaking moment. Then applause erupted, students rising to their feet with tears in their eyes. Ms. Delgado wiped her cheeks discreetly while Sarah Chen nodded approvingly, both clearly moved by the performance. Later that afternoon at the FBI field office, Malcolm Brown presided over a different kind of performance. The conference room was filled with community leaders and law enforcement veterans, their expressions ranging from interested to skeptical as they discussed new training protocols. "These bias awareness exercises," one older sergeant said, shaking his head. "They sound good on paper, but you can't change how people really think." Captain Mason Lewis leaned forward in his chair. "The preliminary results suggest otherwise. We've seen marked improvements in officer-civilian interactions." "With all due respect," another veteran officer cut in, "people don't change their core beliefs just because of some sensitivity training." That's when Officer Kent cleared his throat. The room fell silent as he spoke, his voice quiet but firm. "I used to think the same way," he admitted. "But this program?" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "It showed me things about myself I didn't want to see. Things I needed to see." Officer Bradley nodded slightly from his seat while Malcolm Brown watched the exchange with careful attention. Evening brought a different atmosphere to the Brown residence. The kitchen counter held a chocolate cake decorated with "Congratulations" in swirling frosting. Ava and Ariel sat at the dining table, surrounded by family, their faces glowing with achievement. "Look at this," Ava said, holding up her phone. She scrolled through comments on the short clip Tiana had posted. "So many kids are sharing their own stories. They're saying our dance gave them courage to speak up." Dr. Olivia Brown watched her daughters from the kitchen doorway, her heart full. The shadows that had haunted their eyes since the incident were finally lifting, replaced by genuine joy. "This is exactly why we chose this path," Malcolm Brown said softly, standing beside his wife. "Not just punishment, but real change. Look at what our girls created from their pain, something beautiful that helps others heal too." Ariel reached for another piece of cake, smiling more freely than she had in weeks. "Ms. Chen said she wants us to perform at the City Arts Festival next month," she announced, her voice stronger, more confident. The room filled with excited chatter about costumes and music choices, the earlier trauma transforming into art and purpose before their eyes. The morning sun cast long shadows through the precinct windows as Officer Bradley and Officer Kent made their way to Captain Mason Lewis's office. The usual buzz of activity felt different now, loaded with sideways glances and whispered comments from their fellow officers. "Look who's back from sensitivity camp," one veteran detective muttered just loud enough to be heard. Officer Bradley's jaw tightened, but he kept walking. Inside the captain's office, the tension eased slightly. Captain Mason Lewis sat behind his desk, his expression firm but supportive. "I've been hearing the chatter," he said directly. "How are you both handling it?" Officer Kent shifted in his chair. "It's different, sir. Some of the guys act like we've betrayed them or something." "Changed our whole worldview over a few exercises," Officer Bradley added, trying to sound casual despite his discomfort. "That's what they're saying." Captain Mason Lewis leaned forward. "Listen carefully. What you've learned, what you're still learning, that's the future of good policing. Don't let anyone make you feel ashamed for growing." By noon, the officers found themselves in a cozy corner of the Daily Grind coffee shop. The casual atmosphere was a stark contrast to the morning's rigid formality. Agent Felicia Ortiz sat across from them, her usual professional demeanor softened by the setting. "My partner of 3 years barely speaks to me now," Officer Bradley confessed, staring into his coffee. "Says I'm not the same guy he knew." Agent Ortiz nodded thoughtfully. "That discomfort you're feeling? It means you're changing in meaningful ways. Real growth often means outgrowing old relationships or helping them evolve with you. I keep thinking about that day with the Brown girls, Officer Kent said quietly. How different things could have been if we'd known then what we know now. That's exactly the point, Agent Ortiz replied. You can't change the past, but you're helping change the future. Later that afternoon, smoke from a charcoal grill drifted across the Brown family's backyard. Malcolm Brown stood at the grill, mechanically flipping burgers while deep in thought. Ava and Ariel sat at the patio table, watching their father with growing concern. Dad, when's the last time you actually slept? Ava asked, noticing the dark circles under his eyes. Malcolm managed a tired smile. I'm fine, sweetheart, just some pressure from the Bureau about resource allocation for the program. Dr. Olivia Brown emerged from the house carrying a pitcher of lemonade. You need to rest, Malcolm. The program won't work if you burn yourself out. The commissioner called again this morning, Malcolm admitted, his shoulders sagging slightly. Some of the old guard are pushing back hard against implementing these changes department-wide. Ariel, who had been quiet, spoke up. But it's working, isn't it? We saw how different Officers Bradley and Kent are now. That's why I can't slow down, Malcolm said, determination mixing with exhaustion in his voice. Every day we wait is another day something could go wrong. Another family could go through what you girls did. Dr. Olivia Brown stepped closer to her husband, gently taking the spatula from his hand. At least let me finish the grilling. Sit down for a minute. The family watched as Malcolm sank into a chair, the weight of his mission visible in every movement. The girls exchanged worried glances, seeing for the first time just how much their father had taken on in his quest to create real change. The morning light streamed through the high school's dance studio windows as Ava Brown, Ariel Brown, and Tiana Roberts huddled around a small table, papers scattered between them. Their excitement was palpable as they sketched out ideas for transforming their upcoming dance showcase into something bigger. We could sell tickets and donate the proceeds to youth programs, Ava suggested, her pen moving quickly across the paper. Maybe even partner with local businesses for sponsorships. Ariel nodded thoughtfully. Dad always says real change happens when communities come together. Ms. Delgado approached their table, her eyes bright with interest. I couldn't help overhearing. A benefit showcase would be wonderful. She pulled up a chair, joining their planning session. The school board would certainly approve, especially given recent events. Tiana Roberts was already typing on her phone. My mom knows someone at the community center. They might help us promote it. We could include different styles of dance, Ariel added softly. Show how beautiful things can be when different cultures come together. At the FBI field office, the atmosphere was considerably more tense. Agent Felicia Ortiz stood before Officer Bradley and Officer Kent in a briefing room, her expression serious as she outlined their final test. Today's scenario will push your limits, she explained, laying out photographs of a mock confrontation setup. You'll respond to a situation with multiple agitated individuals. Weapons may be present, but your goal is de-escalation without force. Officer Bradley's face tightened. Like the day with the Brown girls, he said quietly. Exactly, Agent Ortiz confirmed. But this time, you have new tools, new understanding. Show us what you've learned. Officer Kent studied the scenario details, his hands slightly trembling. What if we mess up? After all this progress? That's exactly why this matters so much, Agent Ortiz replied firmly. Real change isn't just about good intentions. It's about proving you can act differently under pressure. Later that evening, Malcolm Brown sat in his home office, staring at an anonymous email on his computer screen. The message was clear. Some officers within the precinct were actively working to undermine his program. His jaw clenched as he read the details again. Dr. Olivia Brown entered quietly, noticing her husband's troubled expression. Malcolm? What's wrong? He turned the screen so she could read the message. Some of the old guard aren't happy with the changes. They're planning to discredit the program's results. Can they actually do that? Olivia asked, her voice tight with concern. They might try to pressure Bradley and Kent to fail tomorrow's final test, Malcolm replied, running a hand over his tired face, or spread doubt about the program's effectiveness to other precincts. Olivia placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. After everything the girls went through, after all the progress we've seen, I won't let them stop this, Malcolm said firmly, his exhaustion giving way to determination. Too many families have suffered because of unchecked bias. The program works. Bradley and Kent are proof of that. He stood up, gathering his thoughts. If they want to fight against positive change, they'll have to do it openly. I won't let them sabotage this from the shadows. The morning sun cast long shadows across the FBI training facility as Officer Bradley and Officer Kent stood at attention, their faces etched with determination. Agent Felicia Ortiz paced before them, her clipboard held close to her chest. Today's scenario involves a robbery in progress, she explained, her voice steady and clear. Your response must demonstrate everything you've learned these past weeks. Remember, verify facts, maintain calm, and use force only when absolutely necessary. Officer Bradley's fingers twitched slightly at his side. What if we make a mistake? Trust your new instincts, Agent Ortiz replied. You're different officers now. Inside the warehouse, artificial lighting created an eerie atmosphere. Officer Bradley and Officer Kent moved cautiously through the space, their weapons holstered. Suddenly, several agitated witnesses, undercover FBI agents, rushed toward them. It was him! One shouted, pointing at a black man standing near some crates. He's the leader! Officer Kent felt his old habits trying to surface, but he pushed them down. Instead of drawing his weapon, he raised his hands in a calming gesture. Everyone please stay calm. We need to assess the situation. Officer Bradley noticed movement in the shadows. Using his flashlight, he discovered another suspect trying to hide. Through careful questioning and observation, they realized this person was actually responsible for the staged crime. Working together, the officers maintained control without aggressive tactics. They spoke firmly but respectfully to everyone involved, gathering information methodically rather than jumping to conclusions. When the exercise ended, Agent Ortiz approached with a slight smile. The man everyone accused, she said, gesturing to the black agent. He's one of our most decorated field operators, the same one from your earlier training exercises. Officer Bradley exhaled slowly, realization dawning. We almost fell for it again, the automatic assumptions. But you didn't, Agent Ortiz confirmed. You investigated properly, kept your cool, and resolved the situation without bias or excessive force. In his office, Malcolm Brown watched the feed intently. His shoulders relaxed as he witnessed the officers' transformed approach. Their growth was evident in every careful move they made, every measured word they spoke. Officer Kent wiped sweat from his brow. It feels different now, he admitted, like we're finally seeing clearly. That's exactly the point, Agent Ortiz said. Real change isn't just in your minds, it's in your actions under pressure. The relief on both officers' faces was unmistakable. They had faced their final test and proven their transformation was genuine. Their old reflexes had been replaced with something better, true professional judgment untainted by prejudice. The morning light filtered through the blinds of Malcolm Brown's office as he stood before Officer Bradley and Officer Kent. His normally stern expression had softened into one of genuine approval. What you demonstrated yesterday wasn't just procedural compliance, Malcolm said. It showed real transformation in how you approach complex situations. Agent Felicia Ortiz nodded in agreement. Your responses were measured, thoughtful, and free from the unconscious biases we identified at the start. Officer Kent's shoulders relaxed slightly. It feels different now, like we're seeing things we were blind to before. Officer Bradley added quietly, We can't go back to how we were. Not after everything we've learned. The moment of celebration was interrupted by Captain Mason Lewis's arrival. His face was drawn with concern as he gestured Malcolm aside. We've got trouble brewing at the precinct, Captain Lewis said in hushed tones. Some of the old guard aren't happy with these changes. There's talk of leaking stories to discredit the program. Across town at the local hospital, Dr. Olivia Brown stood at a podium, presenting slides about healthcare disparities in different communities. Her trained eye caught two unfamiliar faces in the back row, scribbling intensely in their notepads. As she gathered her materials after the presentation, the reporters approached. "Dr. Brown, what are your thoughts on your husband's new approach to police training?" one asked, voice honey-sweet, but eyes sharp. "Does the FBI director believe being soft on criminals will improve community relations?" the other pressed. Dr. Olivia Brown maintained her professional composure. "My husband's program focuses on effective law enforcement through better understanding. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have patients waiting." That afternoon, Ava and Ariel burst through their front door, chattering excitedly about their upcoming dance benefit. Their voices trailed off when they saw their father in an intense discussion with their mother and Agent Ortiz in the living room. "Someone at the precinct is trying to spin this as weakness," Malcolm explained, running a hand over his tired face. "They're saying we're compromising law enforcement effectiveness." "The media's already sniffing around," Dr. Olivia added. "They cornered me after my seminar today." Ava and Ariel exchanged worried glances as Agent Ortiz spoke up. "We should prepare for increased scrutiny. They'll try to twist this into something it's not." Malcolm turned to his daughters, his expression both protective and concerned. "Things might get complicated for a while. The press could start asking questions, making assumptions." The family gathered closer together, their earlier excitement replaced by a shared tension as they contemplated the brewing storm of opposition and media attention. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead in the precinct's break room as Captain Mason Lewis faced a cluster of veteran officers. Their faces were set in hard lines of disapproval. "We're losing our edge with all this sensitivity training," Officer Rodriguez complained, his coffee cup hitting the table with unnecessary force. "Crime doesn't stop because we're being nicer." Captain Lewis straightened his shoulders. "This isn't about being nice, it's about being effective without unnecessary force or bias." "Tell that to the thugs on the street," another officer muttered. Just then, Officer Bradley and Officer Kent walked in. The room fell silent, tension crackling in the air. Both men felt the cold stares but continued to their lockers, exchanging worried glances. At the high school gymnasium, music echoed off the walls as Ava and Ariel Brown moved through their choreography with Tiana Roberts. Their movements told the story of fear, hope, and transformation. Ms. Delgado clapped her hands, gathering the dancers. "Great work. I have exciting news. The Chronicle and several community leaders will attend the benefit performance." Ariel's face paled. "The newspaper? With everything that's happening?" "Hey," Ava squeezed her sister's hand. "This is our chance to show people what change looks like. Through dance, we can help others understand." Tiana nodded encouragingly. "Your story matters. People need to hear it." Later that night, Dr. Olivia Brown sat at her desk, reviewing patient files when her laptop chimed. Opening the new email, her breath caught. The message was stark. "Your family's fake reform agenda will be exposed. The public deserves the truth." She immediately called Malcolm into the room. He read the anonymous message, his jaw tightening. "I'm calling Felicia," he said, reaching for his phone. Within minutes, Agent Ortiz's voice crackled through the speaker. "Forward me everything," she instructed. "I'll have our cyber team trace it. This crosses a line, threatening a federal officer's family." Dr. Olivia Brown wrapped her arms around herself, looking at Malcolm with worried eyes. "They're not just spreading rumors anymore. They're targeting us directly." The morning sun filtered through the blinds of Malcolm Brown's office as he faced the small group gathered before him. His expression was grave as he held up a printed copy of the threatening email. "This crossed my desk last night," he said, passing copies to Officer Bradley, Officer Kent, Captain Mason Lewis, and Agent Felicia Ortiz. "The language suggests someone familiar with precinct operations." Officer Bradley's face fell as he read the message. "Sir, this could destroy everything we've worked for." "The timing isn't coincidental," Agent Ortiz noted, her eyes scanning the text. "Just as the program's showing real results." At the community center, Dr. Olivia Brown sat across from Pastor James Watson in his modest office. Sunlight streamed through a stained glass window, casting colorful patterns on the worn carpet. "The media can be ruthless," she admitted, wringing her hands. "I'm worried about how they might twist this." Pastor Watson leaned forward, his kind eyes radiating wisdom. "Focus on the facts, Olivia. Show them the changed hearts, the transformed officers. Truth has power." As if on cue, 3 mothers from the neighborhood approached Dr. Brown as she left the pastor's office. "Dr. B. Brown," one called out warmly, "we heard about your husband's program. It gives us hope that things can really change." The school gymnasium buzzed with excitement as Ava and Ariel Brown performed their latest rehearsal. Natural light poured through high windows, illuminating their graceful movements. A small crowd of parents and community members watched, transfixed by the emotional choreography. "That was beautiful," a teary-eyed mother said afterward. "Such bravery to share your story through dance." Before the twins could respond, Ariel's phone rang. The caller ID showed Channel 5 News. The sisters exchanged uncertain glances as Ariel answered. The reporter's voice was eager, requesting an exclusive interview about their experience. Ava gripped her sister's hand as they listened to the proposal. The opportunity to share their story on camera felt both terrifying and potentially powerful. They stood frozen, the reporter waiting for their answer. The morning sun cast long shadows across the school courtyard as Ava and Ariel Brown sat down with the local news reporter. Their friend Tiana Roberts stood quietly behind the camera crew, giving them encouraging smiles as she recorded additional footage on her phone. "Can you tell us about that day?" the reporter asked gently, her microphone extended. Ava took a deep breath. "We were just walking home from dance practice," she said, her voice steady. "Everything changed so fast." Ariel nodded, adding softly, "But our father saw an opportunity for real change. The officers who stopped us, they're different now. They learned through experience what bias feels like." Across town at the precinct, a small group of officers huddled around a computer, manipulating spreadsheets and crime statistics. Their fingers moved quickly, adjusting numbers to show increased criminal activity since Malcolm Brown's new training began. "This should get some attention," one muttered, hitting save on the doctored files. But Captain Mason Lewis had been watching. He noticed the unusual activity in the database and quickly pulled up the original files, comparing them to the altered versions. His face grew stern as he reached for his phone to call Malcolm Brown. "Sir, we have a situation," he said urgently. "Someone's manipulating our crime stats to discredit the program." Malcolm Brown immediately assembled his team to gather the genuine data, working swiftly to compile accurate reports before the false information could spread. That evening, the Brown family gathered in their living room, all eyes fixed on the television as the interview aired. Ava and Ariel appeared composed on screen, their words touching hearts across the city. "We don't want revenge," Ava's voice rang clear through the speakers. "We want change." Dr. Olivia Brown squeezed her daughter's hands as supportive messages flooded social media. Brown twins and positive change began trending locally. Agent Felicia Ortiz entered the room with a determined expression. "Malcolm," she said, holding up a tablet, "we've traced the document alterations. We know who's behind this." Malcolm Brown nodded gravely, though hope flickered in his eyes as he watched his daughter's message resonate with viewers across the city. The morning sun streamed through the windows of Malcolm Brown's office at the FBI field office as he and Agent Felicia Ortiz faced the 2 officers responsible for the falsified statistics. Officer Grayson, a veteran with 15 years on the force, shifted uncomfortably in his chair, while his younger colleagues stared at the floor. "These documents clearly show deliberate manipulation of crime data," Agent Ortiz said, laying out evidence folders on the desk. "The timestamps and user logs match your credentials, Officer Grayson." Malcolm Brown's voice remained measured but firm. "We've tracked every altered entry back to your terminal. Would you care to explain?" Officer Grayson's face flushed red. After a long moment, he spoke, his voice rough with emotion. "Look, this new approach, it's making us soft. We can't do our jobs if we're second-guessing every move." "So you chose to fabricate evidence instead?" Malcolm Brown leaned forward, his eyes intense. That's not just unethical, it's criminal. The weight of those words seemed to crack Officer Grayson's defensive shell. I was wrong, he admitted, shoulders slumping. But you have to understand. This change, it feels like everything we've known is being torn down. Malcolm Brown initiated the formal disciplinary proceedings with a heavy heart, knowing the ripple effects would be felt throughout the department. That afternoon, the local radio station's studio lights blinked as Dr. Olivia Brown and Pastor James Watson settled into their seats. The host, Sandra Martinez, adjusted her headphones and smiled warmly. Today, we're discussing the revolutionary police training program that's making waves, Sandra began. Dr. Brown, can you share some success stories? Dr. Olivia Brown leaned toward the microphone. We've seen remarkable transformations. Officers who've completed the program show significantly better judgment in high-stress situations. They're building real connections with community members. Pastor James Watson added his perspective. Just last week, I witnessed 2 program graduates diffuse a potentially volatile situation through dialogue alone. That wouldn't have happened 6 months ago. The phone lines lit up with callers eager to share their experiences. A mother described how an officer had helped her teenage son instead of immediately assuming he was causing trouble. A shop owner praised the new approach to community policing. At the high school gymnasium, Ava and Ariel Brown moved through their dance routine with graceful precision. The empty bleachers would soon be filled with influential community members, and the thought made their hearts race. Your timing is perfect, Ms. Delgado called out, watching from the sidelines, and the emotion really comes through in those transitions. Tiana Roberts sat cross-legged on the floor, reviewing footage on her laptop. What if you shared a few words before the dance? She suggested. Just something brief about your journey? The twins exchanged glances. Maybe we should, Ava said thoughtfully. People need to understand why this matters. Ariel nodded, wiping sweat from her forehead. Dad always says change happens when people connect with the story behind it. Ms. Delgado checked her phone and smiled. The mayor's office confirmed attendance, along with several council members and community leaders. The sisters continued practicing, their movements flowing with newfound purpose. Each step, each gesture carried the weight of their experience and their hope for a better future. Though nervous energy tingled through their bodies, determination shone in their eyes as they prepared for their most important performance yet. The morning sun cast long shadows through the precinct windows as Captain Mason Lewis stood before his assembled officers. His stern expression left no room for argument as he addressed the tense gathering. The investigation into falsified crime statistics is complete, he announced, his voice firm and clear. Officer Grayson and 3 others will face disciplinary hearings next week. This department has zero tolerance for deliberate manipulation of data. Officer Bradley and Officer Kent sat quietly in the back row, watching their colleagues' reactions. Officer Grayson's face had turned a deep shade of red, while his conspirators stared at their shoes. The room crackled with uncomfortable energy. Furthermore, Captain Lewis continued, the bias awareness program will continue as planned. Those who cannot adapt to these necessary changes should consider their future in law enforcement carefully. A ripple of whispers moved through the room. Some officers crossed their arms defensively, but others nodded in agreement. The tide was clearly turning. Later that afternoon, the FBI field office's press room filled with reporters and camera crews. Malcolm Brown stood at the podium, flanked by Pastor James Watson and Sarah Chen, the mayor's community outreach director. The lights from television cameras created a warm glow as Malcolm Brown began his address. The bias awareness program has shown remarkable success, he stated, his voice steady and confident. Over 30 officers have completed the immersive training, resulting in a significant improvement in community relations and de-escalation outcomes. A reporter raised her hand. Director Brown, how do you respond to the attempted sabotage by certain officers? Malcolm Brown's expression remained composed. Those actions represent the very resistance to change that makes this program necessary. We're addressing the misconduct through appropriate channels, while maintaining our focus on transformation rather than punishment. Pastor James Watson stepped forward to share specific examples of positive community impact, while Sarah Chen, presented data showing improved trust between citizens and law enforcement. As evening approached, the school auditorium buzzed with activity. Stage lights warmed up as Ms. Delgado directed volunteers adjusting the backdrop. Tiana Roberts sat at the soundboard, running final checks on the music cues. Ava and Ariel Brown moved through their routine one last time on the empty stage. Their movements flowed with grace and purpose, telling their story through dance. The sisters had chosen simple black leotards with flowing white overlay skirts that emphasized every gesture. "The timing on that transition is perfect now," Ms. Delgado called from the wings. "Just remember to breathe through the emotional moments." The lobby doors opened as Malcolm and Dr. Olivia Brown arrived, followed shortly by Officer Bradley and Officer Kent. The officers looked somewhat uncomfortable in civilian clothes but determined to show their support. Dr. Olivia Brown helped arrange programs on the seats while Malcolm spoke quietly with the technical crew. The auditorium gradually filled with community leaders, local residents, and media representatives. Backstage, Tiana Roberts gave her friends quick hugs. "You've got this," she whispered, before hurrying to her position at the soundboard. Ms. Delgado did one final check of the stage lights, adjusting levels to create the perfect atmosphere for the performance. The twins stood in the wings, holding hands and taking deep breaths as they heard the murmur of the gathering audience. The house lights began to dim and a hush fell over the crowded auditorium. Ava and Ariel squeezed each other's hands one last time as they waited for their cue. Backstage at the school auditorium, Ava and Ariel Brown moved through their final stretches in synchronized motion. The familiar routine helped calm their nerves, but anxiety still flickered across their faces. Their matching black leotards with flowing white overlay skirts caught the dim backstage lighting as they practiced one last series of turns. "Here, let me fix that strap," Tiana Roberts said, stepping forward to adjust Ariel's costume. Her steady hands moved with practiced efficiency, making small adjustments to ensure nothing would slip during the performance. Ms. Delgado watched from nearby, her clipboard pressed against her chest. "Remember, girls, you've practiced this routine until it's muscle memory. Just let the movement tell your story." Dr. Olivia Brown stood in the wings, her doctor's coat exchanged for an elegant evening dress. She reached out to smooth Ava's hair, her touch gentle and reassuring. "Deep breaths, both of you. You're going to be amazing." "Is Dad coming?" Ariel asked, her voice small with worry. "He promised he'd be here." "He's just finishing up some important paperwork at the office," Dr. Olivia assured them. "He won't miss this." Meanwhile, at the FBI field office, Malcolm Brown sat at his desk, signing the last of several documents with Agent Felicia Ortiz and Captain Mason Lewis standing nearby. The disciplinary paperwork for Officer Grayson and his conspirators lay in neat stacks, each page detailing the consequences of their attempted sabotage. "That should do it," Malcolm said, checking his watch for the third time in as many minutes. The hands seemed to move too quickly as he gathered the papers into official folders. Agent Ortiz accepted the files, her expression professional but pleased. "We'll process these immediately, sir. The message will be clear. Attempting to undermine positive change won't be tolerated." Captain Mason Lewis nodded gravely. "It's not easy confronting resistance within our own ranks, but this program is worth fighting for." Malcolm stood, already reaching for his suit jacket. "Thank you both for your unwavering support. This marks the beginning of real transformation in law enforcement." He paused, allowing himself a small smile. "But right now I have 2 daughters waiting for me." The drive to the school seemed endless, though Malcolm made good time through evening traffic. He hurried through the parking lot, his long strides eating up the distance to the auditorium entrance. Inside, the lobby buzzed with excitement as community members, local officials, and proud parents found their seats. Malcolm slipped through the crowd just as the house lights began to dim. He spotted Dr. Olivia in their reserved front row seats and quickly made his way to her side. She squeezed his hand as he sat down, relief evident in her smile. Behind the heavy stage curtain, Ava and Ariel peeked out through a small gap. Their tense shoulders relaxed visibly as they spotted their father taking his seat. Tiana gave them each a quick hug before hurrying to her position at the soundboard. The auditorium fell silent as the MC stepped up to the microphone, Warm stage lights illuminated the simple but elegant backdrop, designed to complement the evening's message of transformation and hope. "Welcome to our community dance benefit," the MC began, and enthusiastic applause filled the room. Ava and Ariel stood ready in the wings, their hands clasped together, ready to share their story through dance. The stage lights rose slowly, casting a gentle glow on Ava and Ariel Brown as they stood frozen in their opening poses. The auditorium fell into complete silence, save for the first haunting notes of the music they had chosen. Their contemporary piece began with slow, controlled movements that spoke of uncertainty and fear. Ava initiated the first sequence, her body language tense and defensive. Ariel mirrored her movements, creating a powerful symmetry that captured the audience's attention. Their matching costumes caught the light as they moved through the choreography, the flowing white overlay skirts emphasizing every turn and leap. In the front row, Malcolm and Dr. Olivia Brown watched intently, their hands clasped together. The music built gradually, and the twins' movements became more urgent, more desperate. Through their dance, they portrayed the moment of their confrontation with law enforcement. The fear, the confusion, the helplessness. Near the back of the auditorium, Officer Bradley shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Beside him, Officer Kent sat perfectly still, his eyes fixed on the stage. The dance forced them to witness their past actions through art, through the perspective of two young girls whose lives they had nearly shattered. The twins moved in perfect synchronization as they approached a simple wooden barrier placed center stage. Their movements became more determined, more powerful. The music swelled as they danced around the barrier, their gestures expressing frustration and determination. The audience held its collective breath, completely absorbed in the storytelling. In a breathtaking moment, Ava and Ariel executed a series of turns that brought them to either side of the barrier. Their movements spoke of strength found in unity, of courage born from adversity. Together, they pushed against the barrier and it fell away, the sound of it hitting the stage floor punctuating their triumph. The final sequence of their dance transformed into something hopeful. Their movements became lighter, more free, though still carrying echoes of their earlier pain. The twins spun across the stage, their skirts floating around them like wings. Their faces showed both vulnerability and strength as they moved through the last measures of music. Officer Bradley wiped discreetly at his eyes while Officer Kent sat with his hands tightly clasped. The performance forced them to confront the full impact of their actions and the importance of their transformation through Malcolm's program. As the final notes faded, Ava and Ariel struck their ending pose, standing tall, hands clasped, faces lifted toward the light. For a moment, perfect silence filled the auditorium. Then, as if a dam had broken, thunderous applause erupted from every corner. People rose to their feet, many wiping tears from their eyes. Malcolm and Dr. Olivia Brown stood immediately, their faces shining with pride and love. Around them, community leaders, teachers, and fellow students continued to applaud enthusiastically. Near the sound booth, Tiana Roberts beamed as she captured the moment on video. A local reporter in the third row quickly raised her camera, capturing the twins' graceful bow and the audience's standing ovation. Ms. Delgado could be seen in the wings, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue while still managing to clap. The twins held their final bow, their faces flushed with emotion and exertion. They searched the crowd, finding their parents' proud faces in the front row. Malcolm and Dr. Olivia Brown made their way to the stage steps, arms outstretched. Ava and Ariel ran to meet them, falling into their embrace as the applause continued to fill the auditorium. The family held each other tightly on stage, their group hug becoming a powerful symbol of resilience and love. The audience's standing ovation showed no signs of diminishing as more people wiped away tears, moved by both the performance and the evident emotion of the family reunion playing out before them. The school lobby buzzed with excited conversation as attendees filed out of the auditorium. Small groups formed, discussing the powerful performance they had just witnessed. Tissues were still being passed around as people wiped away tears while sharing their reactions. Captain Mason Lewis made his way through the crowd toward Ava and Ariel Brown, who stood near the refreshment table with their parents. His usually stern expression had softened considerably. "That was extraordinary," he said, addressing the twins. "The courage it took to share your story through dance. Well, it's exactly what our community needed to see." The girls thanked him quietly, still processing the emotional aftermath of their performance. Before they could say more, Officer Bradley and Officer Kent approached hesitantly, hanging back slightly from the group. Dr. Olivia Brown noticed them first, giving Malcolm a gentle nudge. The crowd seemed to sense the weight of the moment, and conversations hushed. Officer Bradley cleared his throat, his usual confidence replaced by visible discomfort. "Ava, Ariel," he began, his voice rougher than usual. "What we did that day, there's no excuse for it. Watching your performance tonight showed us exactly how much damage we caused." He paused, struggling to maintain composure. "I'm truly sorry." Officer Kent stepped forward, his eyes meeting the twins directly. "The program your father created, it opened our eyes. But your dance tonight, it opened our hearts. We can't undo what happened, but we want you to know how deeply we regret our actions." The twins exchanged glances, then nodded slowly. The moment was heavy with unspoken emotions. A local reporter, sensing an opportunity, approached Malcolm and Dr. Olivia Brown. "Would you mind sharing a few words about tonight's performance and how it relates to your FBI training program?" Malcolm spoke with quiet authority. "What we witnessed tonight wasn't just a dance performance. It was a powerful testimony about the impact of bias in law enforcement. Our program aims to create the kind of transformation you saw represented on that stage," Dr. Olivia Brown added, her voice warm but firm. "The healing we're seeing isn't just for those who've been hurt by prejudice. It extends to those who recognize their mistakes and choose to change. Tonight proved that both are possible." The reporter scribbled notes enthusiastically, clearly pleased with the positive angle emerging for her story. Back in the now-empty auditorium, Ava and Ariel stood center stage, taking in the quiet after such an emotional evening. The house lights cast a soft glow over the empty seats. Tiana Roberts adjusted her camera settings, capturing candid moments as Ms. Delgado joined the twins. "Come on, let's get a proper photo," Tiana called out, waving them closer together. Ms. Delgado wrapped an arm around each girl's shoulders, her pride evident in her bright smile. Malcolm's footsteps echoed slightly as he walked down the center aisle toward them. "I don't think I've ever been prouder," he said, his voice carrying in the empty space. Ariel took a deep breath, her voice quiet but steady. I think I'm ready to forgive them," she said, surprising everyone. "Not because they deserve it, but because I need to let go of this weight." Tears welled up in everyone's eyes as they came together in a group hug. The moment felt sacred, a release of long-held tension and fear, replaced by something lighter, something healing. Through her tears, Ms. Delgado whispered, "You girls have shown more grace than most adults I know." They held each other tightly, the empty auditorium bearing witness to this tender moment of forgiveness and renewal. The heaviness that had haunted them for so long began to lift, replaced by a tentative but growing hope. The morning sun streamed through the Brown residence windows as the family gathered in the living room. Dr. Olivia Brown sat on the couch, her tablet in hand, scrolling through an endless stream of social media posts about last night's performance. "Listen to this one," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Watching these brave young dancers tell their story made me understand why we need change in law enforcement. Thank you for showing us the way forward. It already has thousands of shares." Ava and Ariel peered over their mother's shoulders, amazed at the outpouring of support. Videos of their performance had spread rapidly overnight, touching hearts across the community and beyond. Malcolm Brown's phone buzzed. He stepped into his home office to take the call, returning moments later with a broad smile. "That was the FBI director," he announced. "They're seriously considering implementing our program nationwide. They say what happened here could be a blueprint for real change." Dr. Olivia Brown wiped happy tears from her eyes as she read another comment aloud. "My son wants to be a police officer, but I've always worried about the culture. Seeing this program gives me hope that things can be different." The family moved to the kitchen where the smell of fresh pancakes filled the air. As they settled around the breakfast table, Ava carefully drizzled maple syrup over her stack. "I've been thinking," she said, setting down the syrup bottle. Maybe we could use dance to raise awareness about other social issues too, like create performances that make people think and feel differently about important things. Ariel pushed her pancakes around her plate, quieter than her sister. After a moment, she spoke softly. "Sometimes I still get scared when I see police cars," she admitted. "But I'm trying to remember that people can change. It's just hard sometimes." Malcolm reached across the table and squeezed her hand. "That's perfectly normal, sweetheart. Real courage isn't about never being afraid. It's about not letting that fear stop you from moving forward." Across town, Officer Bradley sat in his kitchen, sharing coffee with his wife Angela. She watched him carefully stirring his coffee, noting how different he seemed. "You've changed," Angela said softly. "There's something gentler about you now." Bradley nodded, meeting her eyes. "This program, it made me see things I never wanted to admit before, made me understand how my actions affected people." Meanwhile, Officer Kent was visiting his family. His younger brother lounged on the couch, asking questions about recent events that had been all over local news. "Are you still proud to be a cop?" his brother asked, genuine curiosity in his voice. Kent thought for a moment before responding. "I'm proud to be a better cop," he said firmly. "Someone who serves the community the right way." Later that morning, both officers independently contacted Captain Mason Lewis, volunteering to help train future officers in the Bias Awareness Program. They understood now that their experiences could help others recognize and overcome their own prejudices. Officer Bradley drafted an email. "If my story can help prevent another officer from making the same mistakes, I want to share it." Officer Kent made a similar call. "We need to be part of the solution. I want to help teach others what we've learned." Their commitment to change had evolved from reluctant participation to active advocacy, marking a profound transformation in both men's approach to their work and lives. The FBI field office buzzed with quiet anticipation as people gathered for the formal recognition ceremony. The conference room, usually stark and businesslike, had been transformed with rows of chairs and a small podium at the front. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, casting a warm glow over the assembled crowd. Captain Mason Lewis stood at the podium, his police uniform crisp and formal. His voice carried clearly through the room as he addressed the gathering. "What we've witnessed here isn't just a training program. It's a fundamental shift in how we approach law enforcement. These officers," he gestured toward Officer Bradley and Officer Kent, "have shown us that real change is possible when we're willing to confront our own biases." Pastor James Watson followed, his presence commanding attention as he spoke about healing community wounds. "For years, we've talked about building bridges between law enforcement and our communities. Today, we're seeing those bridges become reality." His words resonated with both the officers and community members present, drawing nodding heads and murmurs of agreement. Officer Bradley and Officer Kent sat in the front row, each holding their completion certificates. Bradley's hands trembled slightly as he gripped the document, remembering how resistant he'd been at the start. Kent's expression showed quiet pride, though his eyes held traces of remembered shame when he glanced at the Brown family. Agent Felicia Ortiz approached the podium next, smoothing her dark blazer. "We have two special guests who'd like to share their perspective," she announced, gesturing toward Ava and Ariel Brown. The twins exchanged surprised looks. They hadn't expected to speak. Ava rose first, her dancer's grace evident even in this simple movement. She approached the microphone with determination in her steps. "That night, when Officer Bradley and Officer Kent stopped us, I felt like my whole world was crashing down," she began, her voice steady despite the weight of the memory. "But standing here today, I can't help but think, if this program had existed then, maybe things would have been different. Maybe no one would have drawn a gun. Maybe we wouldn't have ended up face down on the pavement." Ariel joined her sister, her usual shyness overshadowed by conviction. "What happened to us was terrifying," she said softly into the microphone. "But watching these officers change, seeing them really understand why their actions hurt people, it gives me hope. This isn't just about one incident or two officers. This is about changing the whole system, one person at a time." The room fell silent. absorbing the impact of their words. Malcolm Brown watched his daughters with visible pride, then rose to take his place at the podium. His presence commanded attention, yet his tone remained humble. "When I first proposed this program, many thought it was too idealistic," he began, scanning the faces before him. "They said bias was too deeply ingrained to change. But looking around this room today, I see proof that transformation is possible." He paused, allowing his words to sink in. "I want to thank my family for their strength through all of this. I want to thank Officer Bradley and Officer Kent for their courage in confronting difficult truths. And I want to thank our community leaders for believing in this vision." Malcolm straightened his shoulders, his next words carrying the weight of future possibility. "We're currently in discussions with other states about implementing similar programs. What started here, in this community, could soon help prevent similar incidents across the nation." The room filled with appreciative applause, bringing together officers, community leaders, and family members in a moment of shared purpose. Officer Bradley and Officer Kent exchanged glances, their certificates representing not just completion but the beginning of a new chapter in their careers. Morning sunlight streamed through the windows of the Brown residence, casting warm patterns across the living room floor. Ava and Ariel moved in perfect sync, their bodies flowing through a new dance routine they'd created just for fun. The tension that had haunted their movements weeks ago had melted away, replaced by pure joy in the art of dance. Dr. Olivia Brown paused at the doorway, her medical bag in hand, watching her daughters with a gentle smile. "It's so good to see you both like this again," she said, adjusting her lab coat. "Keep that spirit alive while I'm at the hospital." In his home office, Malcolm Brown sat at his desk, reading an official FBI email with careful attention. His expression shifted from concentration to quiet pride as he absorbed the contents. Confirmation that the bias awareness program would be implemented across multiple cities. The weight of this achievement settled on his shoulders, not as a burden, but as a reminder of how far they'd come. Later that day, the local park buzzed with activity as community members gathered for a celebration of improved police-community relations. Colorful banners swayed in the breeze, and the aroma of grilled food wafted through the air. Officer Bradley and Officer Kent stood behind a booth decorated with positive messages about communication and understanding. "Remember," Officer Bradley demonstrated to a group of curious children, "when something bothers you, use your words first." His voice carried a gentleness that would have seemed foreign just months ago. Officer Kent nodded alongside him, showing the kids how to express their feelings clearly and calmly. Nearby, Ava and Ariel took their places on a makeshift performance area, joined by Tiana Roberts. As music began to play, they launched into an impromptu freestyle dance. Their movements told a story of struggle and triumph, of fear transformed into strength. The gathering crowd watched in appreciation, breaking into enthusiastic applause as the performance ended. Parents and officers chatted amicably, sharing stories and snacks. Children played together while their guardians mingled with law enforcement without the tension that had once defined such interactions. The atmosphere felt light, hopeful, a testament to how much had changed in their community. As evening approached, the Brown family gathered on their backyard patio. Fairy lights twinkled overhead like stars, casting a soft glow over their faces. The wooden deck chairs creaked comfortably as they settled in, sharing stories from the day's events. "You wouldn't believe the progress we're making at the hospital," Dr. Olivia said, her eyes bright with excitement. "We're launching new programs specifically designed to reach communities that have historically been underserved." Malcolm sat quietly for a moment, his hands clasped in his lap. "None of this would have been possible without all of you," he admitted, looking at each family member in turn. "Your strength, your support. It made everything we achieved possible." Ava and Ariel exchanged knowing glances from their seats. The memory of that frightening night still existed, but they had transformed it into something powerful, a catalyst for real change. Ariel's laugh rang out as Ava made a playful comment about performing on bigger stages next year, suggesting venues that could bring even more people together. The family continued sharing their hopes and dreams under the twinkling lights, their voices mixing with the gentle evening breeze. Their contentment was evident in their relaxed postures and easy smiles, secure in the knowledge that they had helped create meaningful change in their community. If you enjoyed the story of Malcolm, Ava, Ariel, Officer Bradley, and Kent, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.